November 1944. The lagoon at Ulithi Atoll lies still beneath a sky the color of burnished steel. A damaged battleship, her hull scarred by torpedo strikes and her starboard list visible even from shore, moves slowly through the coral-protected waters. Her engines rumble at quarter speed. Men line the rails, silent, watching the horizon. And then they see it. Rising from the turquoise waters like a steel cathedral, sections of latticed metal tower above the surface, each segment wider than a city block, each beam thick as a man's torso. The floating dry dock, WW2, waits with its massive gates open, a mechanical mouth ready to swallow 30,000 tons of warship whole. The battleship moves forward. Water churns white at her stern. Slowly, impossibly, she glides into the dock's embrace, and the gates close behind her like the doors of some industrial temple. Within hours, pumps will drain millions of gallons, and the ship will rise from the sea as if lifted by invisible hands, her wounded hull exposed to sunlight and welding torches, her return to battle measured not in months but in weeks. 6,000 miles to the west, in a windowless room beneath the Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters in Tokyo, staff officers study reconnaissance photographs with mounting disbelief. The images show not one but multiple floating structures anchored across the Central Pacific, at Espiritu Santo, at Manus, at Eniwetok, at Guam. Each dock capable of lifting battleships. Each positioned 1,000 miles closer to Japan than Pearl Harbor. The implications settle over the room like ash. One admiral sets down his magnifying glass and speaks quietly. The Americans, he says, have brought their shipyards to the war. The strategic calculations that had governed Japanese naval planning for 3 years, calculations built on the assumption that damaged American vessels would require weeks of transit to reach repair facilities, that attrition would slowly erode enemy strength, that distance itself was a defensive weapon, had become obsolete. The floating dry docks represented something the Japanese High Command had not anticipated, could not match, and did not fully understand until it was far too late. They were not merely engineering marvels. They were the physical manifestation of an industrial philosophy so alien to Japanese doctrine that even seeing the evidence, many officers struggled to accept its implications. The story of these docks begins not in the Pacific but in the dockyards of Mobile, Alabama, and the drawing rooms of naval architects who understood that the Second World War would be won or lost not on the quality of individual ships but on the ability to keep those ships fighting. In early 1942, as the American carrier fleet licked its wounds from Pearl Harbor and prepared for the long counteroffensive across the Pacific, Navy planners confronted an uncomfortable truth. The nearest major dry dock facilities to the Central Pacific combat zones lay at Pearl Harbor, 5,000 miles from the Solomon Islands, 6,000 from the Marianas. A cruiser damaged off Guadalcanal would require 2 weeks steaming just to reach repair facilities, then weeks or months in dock, then 2 weeks returning to the front. During that time, she was useless. Worse, the journey itself was dangerous. Submarines prowled the routes, and a limping warship made an easy target. The Japanese knew this. Their entire attrition strategy depended on it. Sink enough American ships, damage enough that they must withdraw for repair, and the logistics alone would grind the offensive to a halt. But American naval architects and civil engineers had been thinking about this problem since before the war began. They had studied the limitations of traditional dry docks, permanent structures of concrete and steel, immovable, vulnerable to air attack, requiring years to construct. And they had asked a radical question: what if the dry dock could move? What if instead of bringing damaged ships back to fixed facilities, the facilities could be brought forward to the ships? The concept wasn't entirely new. Floating dry docks had existed for decades, used primarily in harbors where bedrock made permanent docks impractical. But those were small, designed for destroyers and merchantmen, certainly not for battleships or fleet carriers. What the U.S. Navy proposed was something unprecedented in scale. A sectional floating dry dock that could be built in pieces, towed across oceans, assembled in forward anchorages, and used to lift and repair the heaviest warships afloat. The Advanced Base Sectional Dock, ABSD, would be more than 800 feet long, over 240 feet wide, and capable of lifting 90,000 tons. It would be, in effect, a mobile shipyard that could be positioned wherever the fleet needed it. The engineering challenges were immense. Traditional dry docks relied on solid foundations and rigid structures. A floating dock had to support the entire weight of a battleship while itself floating on water, maintaining stability in swells and currents, resisting the immense pressures exerted when the internal water was pumped out and the ship's weight transferred to the dock's deck. The solution was modular design. Each ABSD consisted of 7 to 10 sections, each section a self-contained floating steel box measuring approximately 90 feet long and 250 feet wide. The sections were built separately in different yards, some in Alabama, some in California, then towed individually to assembly points. Once connected by massive steel pins and hydraulic seals, they formed a single continuous structure. The dock's walls rose nearly 60 feet above the waterline when ballasted, with pumping stations capable of moving 15,000 gallons per minute. When a ship entered and the gates closed, controlled flooding would sink the dock until the vessel floated above the submerged deck. Then pumps reversed, expelling water, and the dock would rise, carrying the ship upward until her keel rested on wooden blocks precisely positioned to support her weight. The entire process took less than a day. The first ABSD units were completed in late 1943. ABSD-1 was towed to the Admiralty Islands. ABSD-2 went to Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides. ABSD-4 was positioned at Manus. Each journey took weeks, the sections crawling across the Pacific at 5 knots, shepherded by tugboats, vulnerable to storms and submarines. The men who crewed these tugs and later worked the docks were not frontline sailors but civil service employees and Seabees, construction battalions trained to build bases under fire. They welded in 100-degree heat, worked through tropical rainstorms, and lived in tent cities on coral atolls where fresh water arrived by tanker and mail came once a month. Yet their work was as critical as any battle. A battleship hit by torpedoes off Leyte Gulf in October 1944 could be inside a floating dry dock at Manus by November, her hull plating replaced and systems restored by December, and back on the gunline off Okinawa by January. Without the dock, that same ship would have spent 4 months in transit and repair at Pearl Harbor or the West Coast, effectively removing her from the war for half a year. The Japanese had anticipated none of this. Their own approach to naval logistics was fundamentally different, rooted in a philosophy that emphasized offensive operations over sustainment. Japanese doctrine assumed that decisive battle would be sought and won quickly, that the war would be short, that damaged ships would return to home waters for repair in the established naval arsenals at Kure, Yokosuka, and Sasebo. They built no equivalent to the ABSD. They established no forward repair bases on the scale of what the Americans created. When Japanese heavy cruisers were damaged, they sailed back to Japan, if they survived the journey. Many did not. The submarine USS Harder sank 3 Japanese destroyers in 4 days partly because those destroyers, damaged in earlier engagements and limping home for repair, made slow and predictable targets. Meanwhile, American destroyers damaged in the same waters were dry-docked at Manus, repaired, and back in action before the Japanese ships would have even reached Yokosuka. This disparity became evident to Japanese commanders gradually, then all at once. In early 1944, as American forces seized the Marshall Islands and established bases at Eniwetok and Kwajalein, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft photographed what appeared to be construction activity in the lagoons. Intelligence officers noted the presence of large floating structures but initially misidentified them as pontoon bridges or floating barracks. Only when clearer photographs arrived, showing battleships and cruisers literally sitting atop these structures, their hulls fully exposed and surrounded by scaffolding, did the realization strike. The Americans had transported entire shipyards across 5,000 miles of ocean. They had turned remote atolls into industrial complexes. And they had done so with a speed and scale that Japanese industry, already stretched thin by 3 years of war, could never hope to match. The psychological impact on Japanese naval leadership was profound. For decades, the Imperial Japanese Navy had prided itself on technical excellence and operational audacity. Japanese ships were often superior in night fighting capability, torpedo armament, and individual ship design. Japanese sailors trained harder, and their doctrine emphasized aggressive action and decisive engagement. But the floating dry docks represented a different kind of superiority, not tactical but systemic. They demonstrated that the Americans had rethought war itself, not as a series of battles but as a logistical problem to be solved through industrial engineering. This was profoundly alien to the Japanese military mindset. The samurai ethos that still colored IJN culture emphasized spirit, discipline, and willingness to sacrifice. The idea that victory could be achieved through superior supply chains and maintenance infrastructure seemed almost ignoble, a merchant's approach to what should be a warrior's struggle. Yet the evidence was undeniable. In the battles of 1944, the Philippine Sea in June, Leyte Gulf in October, American ships that should have been in dock for months appeared again and again in action. The fleet carrier USS Franklin, severely damaged by a bomb hit in October, was repaired at Ulithi and returned to combat within weeks. The battleship USS Pennsylvania, struck by aerial torpedoes during the Surigao Strait engagement, was lifted by ABSD-3 at Manus on November 3, her damaged propellers removed, her flooded compartments pumped and repaired, and by December she was firing her 14-inch guns at Japanese positions on Leyte. Japanese commanders reading intelligence reports of these rapid repairs began to understand that they were not fighting merely the American Pacific Fleet but the entire American industrial economy, deployed and operational at the very edge of the combat zone. One captured Japanese staff document, recovered after the war and translated by occupation authorities, reveals the depth of this shock. Dated January 1945, it analyzes the Ulithi anchorage through reconnaissance photographs and reports from agents in the region. The document catalogs the presence of 2 large floating dry docks, multiple repair ships, floating cranes, ammunition barges, fuel depots, and quarters for over 10,000 support personnel. The author, a commander in the IJN Logistics Bureau, concludes with a striking admission: the enemy has negated distance as a defensive factor. Our strategy of attrition through sustained engagement has failed because the Americans do not attrit. Their damaged ships do not leave the theater. They are repaired in place and return to battle faster than we can sink them. We have no counter to this capability. The resignation in those words is palpable. This was not a tactical problem that could be solved through better training or bolder tactics. It was a structural disadvantage baked into the very foundations of how each nation approached industrial war. The men who worked the docks saw the war differently than those who fought at sea. For them, the enemy was not Japanese pilots or submarines but heat, fatigue, and the relentless pressure of time. A typical repair operation began when a damaged ship entered the dock at dawn. By midday, the dock would be pumped dry, and teams of welders, pipe fitters, electricians, and hull technicians would swarm over the vessel. Work proceeded in shifts around the clock. Welding torches flared in the darkness, their blue-white light reflecting off the lagoon. Arc welders wore goggles and leather aprons, their skin slick with sweat in the tropical humidity. Rivet guns hammered out a percussive rhythm that echoed across the water. Hull plates weighing several tons were hoisted into place by floating cranes, positioned to within fractions of an inch, then welded into place with seams that had to be absolutely watertight. Propeller shafts, each one a precisely machined steel rod 40 feet long, were removed, inspected, and either repaired or replaced from spare stocks kept in warehouse ships anchored nearby. The scale of the operation was staggering. A single battleship repair might require the labor of 500 men working continuously for 3 weeks. Materials consumed included thousands of pounds of welding rod, hundreds of hull plates, miles of electrical cable, and entire systems of piping and pumps. Every item had been manufactured in the United States, shipped across the Pacific, and stockpiled in forward depots against the moment it would be needed. The logistics of this supply chain, the trains that carried steel from Pittsburgh mills to Gulf Coast ports, the merchant ships that transported it across submarine-infested waters, the inventory systems that tracked every bolt and bracket, were as critical as the docks themselves. And unlike the Japanese, who by 1944 were rationing steel and copper, cannibalizing damaged ships for parts, and struggling to maintain even basic production levels, the American supply chain operated with what seemed to Japanese observers like limitless abundance. This abundance became its own kind of weapon. Japanese sailors, when captured, often expressed astonishment not at American firepower but at American logistics. One submariner, picked up after his boat was sunk off the Philippines, was treated aboard an American destroyer and later interrogated. His interrogation report, filed with U.S. Naval Intelligence, records his bewilderment at the routine luxury of the destroyer's mess: fresh bread, canned fruit, coffee unlimited. When asked about Japanese submarine rations, he described pickled vegetables and rice, supplemented by fish when the crew could catch them. The contrast was not lost on him. He remarked that if America could afford to feed its sailors this well thousands of miles from home, Japan had already lost the war. That abundance extended to everything. American ships carried spare parts for systems that Japanese vessels wouldn't repair until returning to port. American bases had machine shops capable of fabricating custom components. American seaplanes delivered mail and medicine to remote atolls where Japanese forces would have been left to fend for themselves. And yet the floating dry docks were more than symbols of abundance. They were instruments of a specific strategic vision. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, understood that the advance across the Central Pacific required not just taking islands but turning them into forward bases faster than the Japanese could react. The traditional approach, seizing an island, then spending months constructing port facilities and airfields, gave the enemy time to regroup. Nimitz wanted speed. He wanted to hit an island, secure it, and within weeks have it functioning as a logistics hub for the next leap forward. The floating dry docks were central to this strategy. They could be towed into position and operational within days of an island's capture. ABSD-1 arrived at Manus in the Admiralty Islands in May 1944, less than 3 months after the island was taken from the Japanese. By July, it was repairing cruisers damaged in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Japanese, watching this unfold, could only marvel at the speed of transformation. Islands they had held for years with minimal development became American fortress bases in weeks. The climax of the floating dry dock strategic impact came in the final year of the war. By early 1945, the American fleet stood off Okinawa, the last island before Japan itself. The kamikazes came in waves, hundreds of pilots diving their aircraft into American ships. The carnage was horrific. Destroyers were hit and set ablaze. Carriers took bombs through their flight decks. The fleet endured, but the damage was immense. In earlier campaigns, such losses might have forced a pause, a withdrawal to Pearl Harbor or even the West Coast for repairs. But in 1945, the damaged ships sailed not east but to Ulithi, Guam, or Leyte, where the floating dry docks waited. Destroyers with their sterns blown off were lifted, repaired, and back on picket duty within weeks. The carrier USS Bunker Hill, devastated by 2 kamikazes that killed nearly 400 men and left her flight deck a smoking ruin, was judged too damaged to repair forward, but even she made it only as far as Bremerton, arriving months earlier than she would have without forward repair work done at Ulithi to stabilize her for the voyage. The fleet's ability to absorb punishment and continue fighting demoralized Japanese defenders far more than individual American victories. It conveyed the message that no amount of sacrifice, no level of fanaticism, could overcome the sheer material superiority arrayed against them. Japanese generals and admirals, in their post-war testimonies and memoirs, returned again and again to this theme. Admiral Yonai Mitsumasa, who served as Navy Minister in the final months of the war, wrote in his diary that Japan's defeat was inevitable once he understood the scale of American forward logistics. He described visiting a captured American manual on base construction and being stunned by its comprehensiveness. Detailed instructions for everything from water purification to dock assembly, all written with the assumption that the necessary equipment and materials would be available. Japanese manuals, by contrast, emphasized improvisation and endurance, making do with what was at hand. Yonai concluded that the 2 documents represented 2 entirely different conceptions of war, and that Japan's conception, rooted in Bushido and spiritual strength, was obsolete in an industrial age. The floating dry docks, in his view, were proof of this obsolescence. They were unromantic, utilitarian, and utterly devastating in their effectiveness. The symbolic weight of the docks grew heavier as the war ground on. For the men who worked them, they became a point of pride, a tangible contribution to victory in a war where glory seemed reserved for pilots and infantrymen. For the sailors whose ships they repaired, the docks were lifelines, the difference between survival and slow death on the voyage home. And for the Japanese, they became emblems of an enemy that could not be understood within the traditional frameworks of naval warfare. There is a haunting account, recorded in the post-war interrogations conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, of a Japanese naval aviator who flew reconnaissance over Ulithi Atoll in late 1944. He described seeing the anchorage filled with American ships, carriers, battleships, cruisers, and in the center of the lagoon, the massive floating docks, their steel frameworks glinting in the sun. He said he felt not fear but a kind of despair, a realization that his squadron, his courage, his willingness to die, meant nothing against an enemy that could build such things and place them here, 7,000 miles from their homeland, as casually as one might set up a workshop. That despair was not universal, but it was widespread. As the war entered its final months, Japanese units in the Pacific were increasingly isolated, cut off from resupply, reduced to scavenging and starvation. In contrast, American forces operated from bases that, despite being built on remote coral atolls, functioned with an efficiency that rivaled stateside facilities. Ships received not just repairs but upgrades, new radar systems, additional anti-aircraft guns, improved fire control computers, all installed at forward bases using equipment shipped from American factories. The contrast could not have been starker. On Saipan, captured Japanese positions revealed soldiers subsisting on roots and rainwater, their equipment rusted and their ammunition exhausted. A few miles offshore, American sailors in the fleet ate hot meals, watched movies on the hangar decks, and sent letters home via airmail that arrived in the States within a week. The war had become asymmetric not just in firepower but in basic sustenance. The floating dry docks continued their work even after Japan's surrender. In September 1945, ABSD-2 repaired the destroyer USS Hugh W. Hadley, damaged by a kamikaze in the war's final weeks. In October, with the fighting over, the docks began lifting ships that needed routine maintenance, helping to prepare the fleet for occupation duties. Some of the docks remained in the Pacific for years, used during the Korean War and beyond. ABSD-3 served until 1959, when it was finally decommissioned and sold for scrap. Its steel, once part of the most advanced mobile shipyard in the world, was melted down and repurposed, the metal returning to the industrial cycle that had created it. Other sections were scuttled in deep water or left to rust in forgotten harbors, their purpose outlived, their history fading. But their legacy endured in ways both concrete and conceptual. The principles demonstrated by the ABSDs, modularity, forward deployment, the integration of logistics into operational planning, became foundational to modern American military doctrine. The aircraft carriers of the Cold War relied on underway replenishment and forward bases that owed their existence to the lessons learned in the Pacific. The container ships that revolutionized global trade in the post-war decades applied the same modular logic that made the sectional dry docks possible. And in a deeper sense, the docks represented a philosophy of war that valued sustainability over heroism, systems over spirit, the patient accumulation of advantage over the dramatic gesture. This philosophy was alien to the Japanese military culture of 1941, but by 1945, it had proven devastatingly effective. There is a photograph, taken in early 1945, that captures something of this. It shows ABSD-4 at Manus, with a heavy cruiser resting in its embrace. The cruiser's hull is battered, her port side scarred by shell hits, her forward turret visibly damaged. Around her, workers swarm, tiny figures against the immense scale of ship and dock. In the background, the jungle-covered hills of Manus Island rise green and indifferent. The image is unremarkable in one sense. It is simply a record of a repair operation, one of hundreds conducted during the war. But it is also a portrait of a certain kind of power, the power to project not just violence but infrastructure, to extend the reach of industrial civilization into the most remote corners of the earth, and to do so not temporarily but sustainably, with the expectation that this reach would be maintained as long as necessary. The Japanese generals who studied such photographs in the war's final months understood, perhaps better than anyone, what they represented. They had been trained to think of war in terms of battleships and carriers, of tonnage and armor and firepower. They had studied Trafalgar and Tsushima, seeking lessons in decisive engagement. But the American floating dry docks taught a different lesson, one their training had not prepared them for. They taught that in modern war, the decisive factor might not be the battle but the repair, not the clash of fleets but the ability to return a damaged fleet to action. They taught that logistics, so often dismissed as the unglamorous rear echelon, could be as decisive as any admiral's tactics. And they taught that a nation capable of designing, building, towing, and operating such structures, while simultaneously waging war across 2 oceans and a continent, was a nation that could not be defeated by courage or sacrifice alone. As the last American warships sailed out of Ulithi Atoll in late 1945, the floating dry docks remained at anchor, their pumps silent, their decks empty. Seabirds nested in their steel frameworks. Rust began to bloom on surfaces no longer maintained. The war was over, and the docks, like so many instruments of that war, had become obsolete the moment their purpose was fulfilled. But they left behind a truth that outlasted their steel, that wars are won not by those who fight the hardest, but by those who can sustain the fight longest, not by the sharpest sword, but by the forge that produces 1,000 swords and the supply line that delivers them to the front. The floating dry docks were forges. They were supply lines. They were the unseen infrastructure of victory, and the shock they induced in Japan's generals was the shock of realizing, too late, that they had been fighting not just an enemy fleet but an entire industrial civilization that had learned to make war as systematically and efficiently as it made everything else. That realization, more than any battle, signaled the end.